Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrew Laird. I'm the Chief Executive of Mutual Ventures. We're a public services consultancy which works with local and central government, and in particular with places, which is part of what we're going to be talking about today. As well as that, we got a real interest in how to better develop place leadership and to support better collaboration between organizations and services at a local level. But we're here today to reflect on the amazing Liberating Public Services Conference, which took place in Gateshead in March. Many of you listening and watching today may have been there, or perhaps some of you, like me, unfortunately missed it from circumstances out of my control and want to understand a little bit more about what went on at the conference and what really all the fuss is about, because there is a lot of interest in this concept of liberating public services. So before we get into this, I'm going to ask Hannah and Mark to introduce themselves. But before I do, just some housekeeping. This is being recorded, and I will be sending a copy of the recording to everybody. We'll also send out some links to some of the papers and pieces of writing that we will undoubtedly touch on during our conversation today. But before getting into Hannah and Mark's reflections on the conference itself, Mark, would you mind just introducing yourself? And I'll get Hannah to do that as well. And then Mark, if I could come back to you just to really briefly summarize what the Liberated Method is in case someone's really new to it. So over to you two to introduce.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, yeah, my name's Mark Smith. I'm the Director for Public Service Reform at Gateshead Council, but I'm also the Senior Responsible Officer for the Changing Futures programme, Changing Futures Northumbria, I should say. I'm also a Fellow at Northumbria University, which brings me on nicely to Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah Hesselgreaves. I'm a Professor of Organisational Learning and Development at Northumbria University, and I'm really interested in evaluation and specifically evaluation of learning programmes, and that is why I'm helping out with the Changing Futures Northumbria work, is just to think about what does evaluation look like in this sort of work and how might we use that and use evidence to proliferate it and make it mainstream.
Okay.
Fantastic, thank you. Mark, would you mind just summarising the Liberated Method?
Okay, so Liberated Method is essentially what happens when you strip out the constraints of a system and you start with the people. I mean, I have this thing about you start with services, you end up with services. But what happens if you start with people? So the Liberated Method essentially, from the work point of view, it's based on essentially understanding rather than assessing people and allowing workers to operate with freedom within 3 rules. The rules are that we don't do any harm and we don't break the law, and that we're clear with the people that we're helping what the purpose of the work is. When you do that, it liberates it and it enables people to work in a really intuitive and relationship building way. So what it's not is a preconceived notion of protocols, procedures, pathways, eligibility. It's about meeting people where they are and working with them on what matters. And if you do that, it requires public services to look completely different. So the Liberated Method in operations is what I've just described. The Liberated Method in its entirety is about we evaluate differently, we lead differently, we commission differently, we do change differently, all based on relationships and non-transactions. Is that a nutshell?
That is, yeah, that's perfect. And for anybody who wants to read more, we will send links to plenty of information about it, and it really is a very rich read. So I suggest that you read all that when I send it to you. So Mark, it would be great just to get your reflections on the conference, because I was so sorry to miss it. I had the twin problem of visiting family and then illness, and I was really upset to actually miss it. But I've talked to some people who were there and they said it was an amazing day. How did you think it went?
Oh, it was great. I mean, we'd never organised a conference before, it's new for us. And we normally, I'm reliably informed, particularly with a conference that's free, you get about 20% not turning up, and we only had 10 fewer people than was registered. So we had 240, I think, people turned up. My impressions of it was that there was everyone was really into it. There was a real vibe.
Yeah.
People were really keen to explore. And I suppose, and I've written a little bit about this recently, my kind of take is that it started off the way everyone was engaging in terms of a rebellion, in terms of, look, we're really trying to book the system here. But it ended up being more about a movement around and about people's own movement. How can we actually, what we're going to do when we walk out the door, whether or not we're part of a cause or a group. I think that the notion of a rebel alliance being a learning alliance is something that really jumped out at me when I spoke to people. So I thought that was great, and it feels like there's a real community of practice already in existence, and a lot of people are already doing this kind of stuff, and all of that came through. So it felt great. It felt like we were about a way of working, a way of thinking, rather than trying to create a club. And I'm really pleased about that, because the last thing I want to do is create a club. So yeah, it felt great. It was invigorating. It was knackering. But it was really, really good, and we were just thrilled with the amount of interaction that we had with people that turned up.
Fantastic. Hannah, how did you feel about the day?
I loved all the bits that everyone else did. Yeah, I thought that we had a panel session, and I thought that was really, really brilliant. But I guess what came over for me was that there was a general impetus in the room for people to want to do something. So it was almost as if that case for change didn't need to be made, which was really refreshing and really nice, and meant that we were several steps forward than I thought we might be when we went in. So as an academic, you walk into rooms at conferences very defensive and very ready to make a really strong case, and we didn't have to do that. People already had their frustration and dissonance, and they were already bringing them to the room. So when we asked people, what is it you want to go do on Monday, what they were doing was writing to us about what should we do on Monday. And I think there's a thing about just people trusting their intuition, because the Liberated Method is such an intuitive thing to do. So yeah.
And is it a case, it feels to me that people are really open to this type of thinking now, even people that maybe previously might not have been, because almost everything else has been tried. Individual services, and I know you don't like to talk about individual services, but individual services are squeezed so there's no juice left, and this collaborative way of working is really probably the only way to sustainable local public services. Would you think? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is. I think there's I guess linked to that point is this idea that people, I mean, we'll pick this up, I imagine, during the course of this chat today, but one of the things that is noticeable is that without realizing it, there's a learned helplessness about the way we frame questions. And that's been developed by this current system of new public management. So what you get is, I really love this work. I can see why it works. It's brilliant. We need to get rid of all the bureaucracy. So what does your risk and issue log look like? And how does the government, and then they'll describe a whole bunch of bureaucracy that this is intended to serve, or how can we keep the middle managers happy? So I suppose the point I would make is that there was something about that people got this, but they were worried about it on behalf of other people. But actually, increasingly, the sense of hang on, this isn't working. There is no business case for staying as we are. So what normally you get asked for a business case if you want to change anything, but a sense of defiance and frustration around, actually, why would we carry on? Why are people that want to carry on doing so from the basis that they have a good reason to, and actually there is no reason to carry on like this? I think that came out for me, that sense of defiance and the sense that we're absolutely onto something. So yeah, there's a worry about inertia and new public management, but people are disassociating themselves from it increasingly, and I think I felt that on the day.
Yeah, I'm going to come on to ask you about new public management in a bit later, but I just want to start with a couple of questions. And I should say to people listening, I should have said this at the start, you can submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom. The chat function isn't enabled because there are a lot of people here and it would get a bit unruly. So please do put questions that you want to put to Hannah and Mark in at the bottom, and I'll try to get to as many of those as I can. So I just want to start with two really kind of broad questions. You engaged with a lot of people during the day. Did you hear anything from attendees that pleasantly surprised you? Because I'm sure you were going into the conference thinking people's attitudes might be one way, and is that how it turned out?
Yeah, I think there was quite a bit. One, just thinking about some examples. What was pleasantly surprising was the breadth of attendees in terms of different sectors and where they come from. We had people from Italy, Jersey, and all around Britain, Scotland, and everywhere. Voluntary sector, civil servants. In fact, one of the things that was particularly pleasantly surprising and was that at some point during, I think, the panel discussion, there was a kind of plausible remark about if only civil servants got this. You know, we're all in the room from local authorities, the NHS, and voluntary sector organisations. And if only the civil service could wrap their heads around the whole notion of relational working. There were civil servants there, and they came up to me after that session and said, "We do get it. Loads of us get it. There's absolutely loads of us in civil service that get this and want this."
Yeah,
and I'm thinking, good on you. A, for calling that out is a bit of a trope, and B, for actually turning up somewhere like this and making that point. So I was really heartened by that. And I mean, Hannah and I have had recent engagement with a few civil servants on this, and there is definitely curiosity. But I was really surprised at that issue, that people were there that day to pick that up.
Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
go on.
No, it doesn't surprise me at all, Mark. There are a lot of civil servants that we work with who get this, but central government is more, I mean, if you think local services are siloed, central government departments are horrifically siloed. There's been quite a bit of research recently on the fact that they're often working across purposes, trying to do the same thing through different angles, and they don't know about each other. So yeah, I'm sorry I interrupted you there, and then we'll bring that in.
I think just the other thing that I was pleasantly surprised at was, well, I shouldn't have been really, but that well, data, it's normally a pretty dry subject, isn't it, data? And my goodness me, the data, the webinar stream around data that Ron Charlton ran, Ron was the reluctant star of the show because he was able to demonstrate with an awful lot of compelling narrative and accuracy just how broken things are and just how effective and different doing Liberated Method is. And it's unarguable, you know. So that in the coffee breaks, that was being talked about a lot, you know, and I was really happy that data and evidence were being discussed so fulsomely and enthusiastically, because essentially what that is saying, you know, that instinct was right and I want to learn more rather than how am I going to persuade my boss to do this. So I was really, really happy with that that sort of spin out from Ron's particular webinar stream.
Yeah. Hannah, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. I was just thinking there while Mark was talking. I think when we have these sort of conversations about relational public services, people absolutely do get it because it feels like it sort of, you know, really, really appeals to what's human about us. But it can feel quite sort of rhetorical. So people say, yeah, I get it. And then they go to, you know, what outcomes can that produce? And it felt like the conversation had moved on that day from rhetorically getting it to, you know, what can that change, to how do we use a method and tell people's stories? And that felt like quite a different shift from rhetoric to method and from data to stories. Felt like a bit of a shift in the way that those things are linked. And it also felt like something really practical. That didn't feel like the sort of things that we say we should think about or that we should be reimagining things. It was more about what does this mean materially for the way that we practice? Yeah,
I think that's so interesting. I love your double hit there: rhetoric to method, data to stories. Donna Hall, who both of you know, and was one of your speakers at the event, talks a lot about the importance of stories, and I find that really interesting. And I think if you could get public servants to think more about stories as opposed to strategies as well. Just that, I mean, that as a consultant, that's really hard for me to say because writing strategies is something we do. But I get the whole, if you build it around stories, that is A, so much more compelling, and, you know, B, people might read it and see it probably ends up making a lot more sense and much more communicable, that's a
Yeah.
word, to staff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you tell a story, we've done a little bit of this work in the last couple of months with the university, with people who are kind of doing relational public services more broadly, including the Liberated Method, and we've asked them to tell stories. And what's great about it is that, you know, if you were a filmmaker, you would have lots of different characters, and you would have some context in a setting, and you'd have a plot, and you'd have all of that stuff. And it's not only interesting and brings it to life, but it does all of the things that research should do. It brings in multiple perspectives. It asks good questions like, what's the point? So I think stories are really brilliant, and they are powerful, and we do hear that that's what politicians act on. They act on stories.
Yes, they do. They do. That they very much do. So can I ask the reverse of that question then? Did you hear anything from attendees that worried you?
I made a noise first. I think one of the things that was interesting for me, and fully put my finger on it, was that people were getting it for sure and understanding it intuitively and as a human, but then would ask questions that were very much of the old system or of the existing system in a way to try and vindicate, I suppose, or validate. So they would say things like, yeah, but how would you scale this? Now, immediately you're into scale logics, you're starting to lose it. This is a method, it's not a service. So the better answer is, how might we proliferate this rather than how do we scale this? Because the minute you get into scale logics, you're into repeatability, you're into standardization, and this thing just, it's not the Liberated Method anymore. Bespoke by default isn't scalable as using scale tools. So what I was getting was questions that the old system would ask of the new work. Things around risk, things around, I would say business cases, but insofar as an orthodoxy, say, convince the old world that the new world's better. Well, the old world is going to want to proliferate the old world. So there was a lot of framing around some of the questions about how to make this proliferate, which to my mind was going to hold it back. And it's not because people were being in any sense negative. It's just a learned thing, and we've all done it. And it's almost like a helplessness regarding how we do change. So I think one of the worries for me is, how do we proliferate it is the question I wanted to hear. I didn't know I wanted to hear it until people were saying, how do you scale it? So I think there's a discussion around growth, which possibly might be something we do next. But yeah, that's one of the things that kind of sort of played on my mind a little bit afterwards.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to talk specifically about how the mindset people have on that. But Hannah, was there anything you heard when you were talking to people that concerned you or worried you?
I think these scale logics were probably one of the things that played on my mind a little bit as well, partly because what we've come away discussing is how do we proliferate, and the sense is that you can just do that by scaling the good stuff that you've got and by minimizing the bad stuff that you've got. But we've only got the tools that we've got to do that. So, we talk about relational working, we go, well, we'll just have lots and lots of relationships, or you can sort of scale up relationships. But I think the relationships actually work at a certain scale. How many friends can you service at one go out? For me, not that many. So I think there's a thing about, there being a nice set of relationships that really work for you. So that was something I was thinking about was, do you create networks and communities of practice and even landscapes of practice around some of this stuff? And the other part of that scaling thing, which is still troubling me, is around the evaluation side of this and how we show evidence for what we're doing. And I think the tools that we've got for evaluation are to evaluate business as usual in a way, fairly mainstream stuff. I think when you want to evaluate something really innovative, then you need innovative evaluation. So I was definitely in my evaluation room for the day, asking people very much every single slide, what do you think about that? What do you think about that? Because you know, I'm only a couple of minutes ahead of myself in terms of what I'm saying evaluation might look like, because we can't scale things using evidence the way we've currently thought about it. So we have to change the way we do method, and we have to change the way we do change, and we have to change the way we do evaluation. So there's a lot to change to demonstrate the change, because the change is so unique that, you know, showing that people's agency increases through the Liberated Method, as an example, is not what most programs are set up to show. Yeah.
And it's not the lived experience of most staff either, most frontline staff trying to do things. So this is a point that you dig into in your academic paper, which I will send a link to, Relational Public Services. You wrote that, the two of you, with Toby Lowe, Max French, Rob Wilson, I think, were the authors. And it's essentially, it's really, really good, actually. I'm not normally a huge fan of academic papers, but I really enjoyed it, I have to say, because it really got, because I'm a total nerd about this stuff, and it essentially explained how, you know, the thinkers and policymakers have all moved on from, you know, the new public management, transactionalism and marketization and all those things that you're pushing against. But the daily efforts of frontline staff are mostly still constrained by that thinking. All of these great thoughts have not filtered down. How is that? I mean, tell us just a little bit about that paper and the conclusions that you both reached from it, because it felt pretty fundamental to me and hard to shift.
Yeah, so I suppose there's a bigger lens about how paradigm shift happens, I suppose. And so the very high level stuff, I suppose, is that relational public services also need to have relational public management and relational public policy as part of this, as part of the network and support mechanism of the way that relationality happens in the public sector. So being able to stitch those things together is really, really important. And we talked at the conference about not just being able to liberate public services. You have to be able to liberate these other parts of state and of being public, which includes the way that you do management, the way you do leadership, commissioning, and all of those things. And I suppose what this paper is trying to say is that it's really, really hard to make that shift when you're only shifting one aspect. So it's that rhetorical thing of, you know, we can talk about relational public services, but unless people are feeling able to live that way, then you don't get those material shifts. What you get are rhetorical shifts, and sometimes you even get policy shifts, but they don't make their way into public management and the way we do incentives and the way we do commissioning. So all of those bits need to move together. Otherwise, it's by definition not a shift in public services, because the shift requires all of that. You can't. What we are seeing through all of the work that we do in the university is that when you're a bit half and half, you know, when you're in that sort of horizon 2 part of change, you're needing a lot of ambidexterity, and you've got to hold a lot of ambiguity, but creating all of that dissonance for change and harvesting that and being able to leverage it is really, really important across all of those different aspects, across policy, management and practice effectively. And when you leave one behind, or one takes a long time to catch up, then we're not getting the seismic sort of efforts that we need.
What you end up with, if you don't turn all of those levers, is lots of really great prototypes or some really interesting movements or but you don't get a paradigm change, you don't get a big move. I think that was the underlying theme of the conference, is unless you do all of these things together, you're not going to win. And new public management is so strong because it is internally consistent with itself, even if it's misguided. We need to create something that is also internally consistent but alternative across leadership, commissioning, valuation and practice. So there's a lot to do. Definitely.
There is a lot to do, and I have jotted down, as you would imagine, some questions here. I'm going to bring two of them together because I think it follows on well from what you've just described. So having spoken to a lot of people around the country, I have a concern that really great practice like the Liberated Method, and there are other examples of some really good stuff, but it feels like a lot of it is happening in an unsustainable bubble that is potentially externally funded in the way that the Changing Futures programs are, and that feels like the powers that be have said, yes, of course we'll take this external funding and we'll give you a home, but without the really great enabling leadership at the top level that goes all across the place, and everyone gets together and decides, yes, we're going to empower staff to work in this way, and when it works, we're all going to own it and not just sit back and say, I'm not funding it in the future. How do we solve that? I mean, I presume, everyone talks about this being, these types of movements being community driven and needs driven, but you've still got to have that enabling leadership that really properly buys into it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's obviously extremely difficult, but I think for us, when we bid for the Changing Futures funding, one of the things we said is that this is the project before the one we need, because it was that bubble. We knew that it was always going to have that. So we said, whatever we do in it has to be about this being able to survive in the wild. So what we didn't want was a really tight project that did a bunch of things that we set out to do. What we were wanting to do more is set out a bunch of things that we needed to learn. And I think what that does, it tells us a load about the Liberated Method, but what critically it tells us is if you focus on learning, you get more done. So you're able to then say, that's what we need to do. We did the piece of work around what we call the burning platform to demonstrate how a failure to do that is really costly and ineffective. So we're almost wanting to say there's no argument for standing still. And here's an argument for essentially a focus on learning, which is more productive than a focus on delivery. And it's more effective and all the rest of it. So we have this thing around what we call attraction rather than persuasion. We didn't want to hawk this around. What we want to do is just say, what do you think of this then? And to focus at a level of principle on what needs doing. If we went around saying we're going to sell you a Liberated Method service, then it would just be competing like it was part of the market. What we really want to do is get people to be curious and dissonant at all those levels, both in terms of how utterly broken it is now and a possible, not just a case for change, but a case for change to this. So I think that's what we've got to do. And I think what you need is lots of movement in lots of places. It can't be us. It can't be a thing over here. What we want to do is make this doable for everyone on Monday so it becomes unignorable, both at a level of practice and then all the other things that Hannah talked about around evaluation, leadership, commissioning. So it's just getting busy in all those places. It's messy. I think we can we can create the opportunity for interested, curious people with power to get a look at this. But what I don't want to do is hope they like it and just sort of try and sell them something. And I think that's what's happening. We're getting that curiosity. People are keen to understand it a bit more. So the way to do it is to do it lots and lots of places. And I think that's where we're at.
Anna?
Yeah, I think that, focusing on learning is more productive than focusing on productivity is absolutely right. And I think when you commission learning and you lead learning and learning happens all the way through an organisation, it becomes a learning organisation, and then your capacity to understand context and do the Liberated Method gets sort of built in. And I'm just thinking about an example that we are working through at the moment with a mental health trust, when they've been sort of asking, well, how could we get this to happen? For example, with our caseworker or our peer support workers are set up to do it like this. And we're kind of going, change a job description then. We've got all the senior leadership pulling for this and wanting it, so they can change the job description. We'll help them do that. And then suddenly you've got 150 potentially peer support workers who can work differently. So the permission space doesn't actually take long to sort out. The ability to train and onboard people, something these guys are really, really experienced in. and these are models that are easy, I think, to do.
Yeah.
If you've got some of those primary conditions in place, which is, that people get it, they've lived through dissonance, they've lived through that sense of unease, that they've been asked to do things that they know aren't in the interest of the people they serve. I think you've got some of those key things in place. There are quite a lot of quick tactics.
Which is very doable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's I'm just going to go to some of the questions now. There's some brilliant ones. So this first one is excellent, and I know it's not one that will have escaped either of you. But do you have any advice in relation to translating this model into children's services and children's social care?
I don't think it's a translation. I think it applies. I don't think it requires any translation. I think if you the 5 principles and 3 rules that underpin it, so let's understand, not assess. Well, why wouldn't we want to do that for children and families? Let's pull for expertise rather than just refer people to experts and allow that to be a necessity refer cycle. Let's not have arbitrary timescales, but let's do things in the time it takes, and let's absorb variety, because if nothing varies like people and families. So I guess if you're able to put non-specialist caseworking capability in with specialists, such that you can create that inner and outer ring that we work with, and that you can essentially reintroduce context into the work. I mean, you talked about stories, and Hannah mentioned that they have a plot, and I kind of use the phrase that public services have literally lost the plot because they're not interested in context. They're interested in a bunch of predetermined things that essentially amalgamate up to an assessment. Yeah. An assessment asks, how much of what we do can we do to you? How much of what we have can we give you? What it doesn't necessarily say is, what is your context? It may allude to bits of that, but I think if the human beings doing these jobs understand context and can absorb variety, but the system itself can't. So what we have to do is make sure that it can, or that the interface between complicated services and complex people is a human and not an algorithm or a pathway or an eligibility criteria. That can work for any group. I think what you need to do is get that non-specialist caseworker or peer support role into those environments and take context seriously. One thing I would say about anything that essentially is aligned to a specialism is that specialisms are hard won, and their badges of honour and name for status. I am a fully qualified children's social worker, housing expert, clinician, say. So when some non-specialist person turns up who's got context, because they bothered to build a relationship, and tell you a bunch of things you didn't know, which are material to what good looks like, it can get an adverse reaction, let me tell you. Yeah. What we need to do is make sure that doesn't happen. And that we enable those specialists who are completely overrun in those children's environments to be able to benefit from somebody who's got time. Someone's got time to build their relationship, because those guys haven't. And so you can interact with them in a way that's really productive, because we're finding social workers are able to make better decisions because there's our workers who've got context. They're not trying to take their specialism off them. They're trying to augment their ability to deploy their expertise through essentially establishing context. So we don't lose the plot, that we keep the plot, and the plot is the right plot. So I think that's how. I don't think it's a translation. I think it's an iteration. I think do it on Monday. Deploy the 3 rules and the 5 principles with some people that have got a mindset around. They can build relationships, they can grow, they can pull in expertise, they can collaborate, they can pull people together. That's relational work. That's all it is. I would say it's. I
know there are some really good children's services departments around the country who do work in a relational way, and people who are listening who work in children's services might be thinking, well, this is all well and good, but we have to satisfy Ofsted, and they might also be thinking, is this something that we should be looking at once we get out of intervention, once we get to good? Is this a good to excellent thing, or at what point should they be thinking about this?
I don't think this is a dichotomy between, because I think, I mean, regulation and John Seddon's doing a lot of stuff at the moment around how regulation is actually a productivity killer, and he's right. He's absolutely right. But what I would say is, it isn't about setting up a dichotomy between doing work that's liberated and making sure that we can appeal to the inspectors. What we say to them is, you want what we want. Everyone is, the purpose here is the same, that we want these things to work. You can do this kind of work in a way that is congruent with the statutory services. I mean, and one way of illustrating that is that when we look at the work our caseworkers do, because we liberate them, and they can, as long as it's do no harm, stay legal, and we analyse it, we look at the tasks that they did that were of benefit. Half of them are completely system agnostic. Half of them would not come under the purview of any regulator or inspector. So you can do a lot without, it doesn't run contrary to that stuff.
This is your do it on Monday thing, isn't it? That actually,
it's what I would call the system agnostic stuff. Most of what is needed by those generalists is not requiring of the system per se. It's requiring of a bunch of stuff that you would never learn if you didn't understand, and if you just stuck to assess.
Yeah.
So I would say that we've got brilliant people in children's service, adult services. It's not about changing what they do, it's about augmenting it with something else that has been designed out in the name of efficiency, but it's killed efficacy.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Hannah, there's a question here about, I mean, if you've got plans to engage with the NHS more on this work, and particularly around local integrated care systems, integrated care boards, places, encouraging them to work more with housing, other statutory services, voluntary sector organisations. I think this is an invitation. Are you thinking bigger than what you're doing at the minute?
Yes. Yes, we are. Yes. And yeah, I mean, partly in response to the fact that some of those very organisations, integrated care systems, trusts, place-based initiatives, have been asking us about how they can do some of this work. So I think those are all commissioned those are all commissioned services, aren't they? And they're trying to figure out how they can work a little bit differently. And what I'm trying to figure out is my little contribution to all of this work is what might the role of institutions be, like universities, and an obvious one at the moment, which we're having lots of conversations with, is sort of in the public health field. So public health get a lot of sort of research and learning and transformation money, and one of the things that we're trying to think about, I suppose, is how we can use some of the agenda around health inequalities, as an example, to pull together some institutional work that already happens and to give it a bit of infrastructure for learning. So again, it's not so much about getting people who have commissioned services to do things that they're not commissioned to do. That is a big bit of it, but it's not just about the delivery of the doing to people or the relating of people. It's also the learning. So most of the conversations that I've been having in the health space is actually about providing some infrastructure and some investment for learning behaviours and learning relationships that enable some of that stuff to effectively, what we're doing is helping people do experiments and then helping people share and learn about other people's experiments. So I think when we're at that level, what we're talking about is genuine capability and capacity building, as opposed to just that sense of, these people are telling us that we should do things differently, and I'm doing things differently to what I was doing last year because my job's changed, especially in the ICSs. My job's changed, we've had a restructure, so sick of change. But if change becomes your business, then even just that reframing it can be a really, really useful business model for people, and those are the sorts of pools that we're getting in that space, and they're easier ones to deal with than the ones of how can I provide a different sort of service to somebody, because that's usually not the question. It's usually what we're doing is we're populating a learning question with a particular health concern.
Yeah, there's good, Mark, sorry, just there's a lot of questions here. I just want to see if I can get through as many of them as I can. There's a good one here for somebody who obviously understands a little bit about your geography, and just asking about the Northeast and North Cumbria ICS and engagement there. I know that you've certainly met with Sam Allen there, and I know that they haven't been, well, all ICSs haven't been short of problems to solve in terms of trying to cut costs and things. But what sort of engagement are you getting there, and do you think there's a chance of influencing things at that level?
Yeah, lots of curiosity, a sense that this has to be part of what the future looks like. One of the things that we are going to do is, after Changing Futures finishes next March, we want to continue essentially incubating what we're referring to, and we talked about at the conference, this Institute for Prevention and Reform. So it's a means by which we can support people and support organisations to proliferate this method in the way that Hannah's described previously. And health are really keen on that. There's a sense, well, in Gateshead in particular, what we want to do, we've had curiosity from mental health and policing, as well as the council and voluntary sector. We're acknowledging that the people that are regularly showing up, consuming huge amount of resources for not much benefit, are the same. Our top 100s will all be the same, or there'll be a huge amount of overlap. So what we want to design next year is a piece of work that looks at that cohort, but we do it open book. So like with health, mental health, police, as to essentially create a clean room type space whereby we can work with using the Liberated Method, a bit like Changing Futures, but it's not a project. It's in the wild. This is not in a bubble. And what we do is two things. The first thing is we materially help those 100 or so people this way, people that hitherto have been bouncing around the system and not really being helped. But the second thing is to be very, very serious about what that's telling us about what the wider system needs to look like. So that we're not just helping 100 people, we're figuring out how to help 2 million people across the region and beyond. So they're part of that dialogue. And what we really want to do is make sure that they're committed to that, both in terms of resourcing the learning and then learning from it. Nobody's signed anything yet, but that's the way the discussions are going. And it's congruent with, but not part of the development of the Northeast Mayoral Authority. That's still very nascent, new mayor as of last week. But what we're doing is we're wanting to get on with this anyway, and then we'll see how it all knits together. But they're very interested in that. But that's something we really want to build.
Really interesting. Have you got any advice for people? So I noted your use of people being curious about it and there being curiosity. Let's say I'm in a council listening to this and I have a conversation with one of my managers or one of my directors, and I sense that there's a curiosity there. What is the journey from curiosity to doing something look like? I know it's not a straight line, but like should I if I'm this person, should I be thinking about this curiosity as just kind of politeness and kind of go away, or what do you do?
Oh God, there's no standard response, you'd be pleased to know, because we're not big on standardization. Although it's
well, exactly.
I guess we are consistent. I mean, you've got to set up some form of experiment. And I think there's two bits to this. The first is, what's the problem we're really trying to solve? And how do we know we've got that problem? So there's something about trying to work out the story and the data. So what was really helpful for us is that we knew, like Brian, in one of our cases that we started, we knew that he was a very good example of the dysfunction around the current model. But we got his data and got him to tell us his story. And that's when we learned that he consumed £2 million worth of services over, 9 years or something. And it was increasing, and his trajectory was for far more, and he was not getting any better and getting a lot worse. So that's the burning platform, to take that curiosity and turn it into something that's even more compelling. And also, whilst you're doing that, just work out who's with you and I always talk about start somewhere and go everywhere. It doesn't have to be a big formal project. If you are curious, but not many other people are, but there's a bit of dissonance, then start with an N of 1 and say, okay, the next person that rings me up and says that they can't pay their council tax, rather than tell them that they have to submit £5 a month and we may leave them alone, I'm going to say how they are and see what that tells me and see what that tells me. And you'll find people that want to know. So if it's very small and you want to grow it, do. It's not about proving it at scale initially. It's about proving it methodologically. And work with the willing. Now, if you've got leaders that are curious, great, but don't, there's something here about, don't make this a persuasive piece, make it an attraction piece. So that look for others that are doing something similar or may have done it already, just to help you out. Now, I don't mean copy off people without getting your own knowledge. I do mean essentially be inspired by it and try and work out how to create your own learning experiment.
I think
this plays into some of the human learning systems stuff. I think it's quite helpful.
I think that's really good advice, and I think what you're describing there is what Donna calls the Rebel Alliance. There are people everywhere who want to see this change, and I think that's great. There's a question for you, Hannah, which you mentioned human learning systems there, but there's a really good question, which is the Liberated Method based on any specific bodies of organizational theory? What are the main inspirations? And I know in your academic note, which I will share, that there are plenty of references at the end of it, but what would you say the main inspiration is?
Oh man. So, I mean, I think the Relational Public Services banner is something under which the Liberated Method fits, and also Mark just mentioned human learning systems, and I think for me there are a number of inspirations in that, and one is the idea of communities of practice and landscapes of practice, because I think that really describes the way that people come together, work together and learn together. I think there's something about becoming a learning organisation and the sort of the learning organisation theory. I think that really points to how difficult some of this stuff is, and it's actually even the learning organisation theory in some ways is slightly under theorised in this sort of context. And I think the third thing is the nature of the human work, and I think when we think about ourselves as being humans, we are automatically relational, and I've just been thinking a little bit about this from a sort of psychological perspectives, like what it means for us as agents to be in relationship with somebody else at a very individual an identity level, but also what it means from a sociological perspective as well, which takes us into the way that we set up relational public services. So I think there's loads of different stuff in there, and the idea of these learning cycles being able to be applied at any scale. The previous question about how would you support someone who's just feeling a bit funny about the way that they currently work and been asked to do it differently. It's the way that some of this started with council tax. Someone really just sitting there saying, what I'm being asked to do just doesn't feel right. And I was reading Helen Bevan had written something about learning being like a sort of a full body experience, and it's very emotional. I think there's a thing about sort of saying, how do I feel when I am asked to, when I'm having to do things that don't feel right? How does that actually make me feel? Reflect on it, record it, write a little note about that, go and speak to somebody about it. Try something sly and see what happens. See how did that feel? Reflect on it, speak to somebody about it. So these learning cycles can happen at absolute minutiae, or they can happen at full organisation and system scale. But there's a thing about kind of that listening to your intuition, I think, and having a record of it. And I think that relationality, that some of the literature would say that it starts there. It starts with your identity and how you identify as a person and what that is in relationship to your job.
There's probably something else I'd add to that from a slightly different angle. So when we started this work with Changing Futures, we wrote the bid on the basis that this was a systems change piece. And what we've learned is that it's not, or at least it's not in a dominant way. The work that we've done, the biggest gains that we've witnessed are when we've created the conditions for people's internal change to be the change, as in the citizens that we're supporting. It's how do we work with them pragmatically by providing extrinsic support and challenge, and it's important that it's challenge as well as support, and that requires a relationship and trust. If you build that, then people's internal agency takes over, and what the method is saying is let it be there to support it. You're not there. You're not a rescuer. So that's key to me, and the reason that because that doesn't require a system change, that requires an internal change. There are people in a recovery community that have transformed their lives out of destitution that haven't touched a service. So the idea that this is systemic is, I think, an incomplete description. Why I bring that up now is because this I've got a systems thinking background, and years ago I used to work at Vanguard, and a lot of the work that we do has some of its roots there. There are some strong similarities, but there are some massive differences. It's not the same. That's because we're trying to solve a different problem. Yeah. And I think that the key difference is that our view is that this is not wholly a systems change piece. Half of the value work is agnostic of the system, so how can it be? So we're trying to work a different way through that's not trying to debunk anything, it's just trying to evolve.
So I've got one quick final question here, and then I want to get your final thoughts on what comes next. So someone's asked here about how they attended on the day, and it was clear to them that all the breakout sessions were essential, but they could only go to one. Is there any plan to try and share some of the learning from those?
Videos have gone out, I think.
Okay, right.
Or have they? I'll have to double check. Maybe they. Just the main sessions. I can't remember whether we video.
Whether they've gone out or not, there are videos, which is great. So there are videos of the different sessions, right? Out. Excellent. Well, that'll answer that question, and whether they're out or coming out, we'll follow up on.
Yeah, I think so. And there's certainly, we want to. There's more writing we want to do to pull a lot of this stuff together. Absolutely right, because that internal consistency thing is really important, and we knew that we didn't want to. We wanted to address all of those levers, but we couldn't do it sequentially. So we just had to. We had to, for practical reasons, break it out into bits. Yeah. But we tried to tie them together, close and the opening and whatever else. But it's a lot of content. Hard.
Yeah, a lot of the content, most of the content was very, very shared. So if you were in one session, you weren't missing something else. But I think that all the main sessions have been recorded. That's and right. Then we can release all the slides from the others. But we went into you went into purger the next day, so we've had to wait until more or less now.
Understood. So just with our last couple of minutes, I want to ask you both what comes next, because you've started something here. There's a real interest in this. There is a bit of a movement behind it, and people want the support community. So what comes next?
Gosh. Well, we do want to create some kind of capability to help people do this without. We don't want to sell the Liberated Method. We want to help people to move towards relational public services. There's a distinct difference between those two things. So we are trying to create what we're calling an Institute for Prevention Reform within the sector that helps people do that. That's a specific resource that's designed to do that. And we'd really like to work with people where they're at. Not just because you can start in operations, or you can start with policy, or you can start at leadership. It doesn't matter where you start. And what we want to do is learn how to start in all those different places and work on all of those levers that we discussed at the conference. So we'd like to develop that, and that's what we're looking to do. One of the things that I've been asked quite a bit is, are you going to do another conference? And my sort of takeaway from one of my takeaways from the day is that we did a lot of talking, and I'd like to do a lot more listening. And also that and this is just the nature of it, having now introduced this method and our experiences in learning, what I'd really like to do is to focus more on what it's like to do the job. Now, people at the conference will have noticed a lot of people running around making this conference work. Those were the caseworkers. They're the people that are giving us things to talk about without nothing.
Yeah.
They're amazing people. And I think that what it's like to do that work, what it takes, how easy or difficult it is, what you need from leadership, and all of that kind of stuff, I think was something that if I was to do another one, I would want to major on that. I think.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks,
but I'd
Mark.
also like for people to say what they're doing and for us to.
Yeah. Hannah?
Yeah. For me, there are three things that probably are archetypes of the way that we're thinking about responding to some of the feedback that we've had. And one is around incubation, so the people who are really interested in how this might look in their context can incubate ideas with us, and can share that learning, and maybe we can provide some support about the way you would the way you do design and do method. There's something which is probably much more straightforward, which is around a sort of an academy of people who want to actually just do the Liberated Method. We can provide basically just do some training, some education around that, and then I think there's a third arc of work and create that learning community. So those feel like three really different but related, fairly concrete streams of work.
Fantastic.
But,
so
would love to know what people think.
Yeah, tell us.
Yeah, so I think that was you broke up a little bit there, but I think Mark and Hannah would like to hear from people what they think should come next as well. So be prepared for the answer to that question, which might come in droves. So thank you so much, Mark and Hannah. That was brilliant. As I said earlier, I will follow up with some links to some of the documents and things that we've mentioned today. And great that so many people were able to make it. And I will stop to give you a minute to get to whatever you're doing next. So thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thanks so much.
Bye.